Have you ever wondered who really controls your money? Not just the cash in your wallet, but the entire economic system we live in. To find the answer, we have to go back in time to a secret meeting that changed America forever. The year is 1910. A private railroad car sits discreetly at a New Jersey station, its window shades drawn tight. Inside, some of the most powerful men in the world are gathered, their identities hidden, their purpose a closely guarded secret. These weren't politicians or government officials. They were the titans of financemen like J.P. Morgan's senior partner, representatives from Rockefeller's National City Bank, and other elite bankers who, together, controlled nearly a quarter of the entire world's wealth. Their destination, a secluded, exclusive retreat off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. To the outside world, this was just a casual duck-hunting trip. The men even avoided using their last names, referring to each other by first names only to maintain secrecy. But they weren't there to hunt. They were there to plan the biggest financial takeover in modern history. Their mission, to redesign America's entire monetary system, not for the benefit of the public, but for themselves. At the time, America was wary of central banks. The memory of powerful, private financial institutions holding the nation's economy hostage was still fresh. But these men knew that to cement their power, they needed to create a system they could control. For 9 days, in absolute secrecy, they hammered out a plan. They debated, they argued, and they drafted a piece of legislation that would fundamentally alter the course of the nation. This document, born on a remote island, was the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve. They knew they couldn't present this plan as their own creation. It would be political suicide. So, they handed it over to a friendly politician, Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose name was attached to the bill. They waited for the perfect moment to strike, and that moment came in late December 1913, with Congress rushing to adjourn for the Christmas holiday, and many of its members already gone home. The Federal Reserve Act was pushed through and signed into law. It happened so quietly, so quickly, that most of the country didn't even realize what had occurred. America had just outsourced its monetary system. So what is the Federal Reserve, really? We're often told it's a government agency, a branch of our public institutions. But that's not the whole truth. The Federal Reserve is a strange hybrid, a quasi-private entity. The main board in Washington, D.C. has members appointed by the president, but the real machinery, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, are owned by the private commercial banks in their districts. Think about that for a second. The very banks the Fed is supposed to regulate are its shareholders. They even get a guaranteed dividend each year from the FED's profits. Before 1913, the U.S. government, through the Treasury, had the constitutional power to create and issue its own money, debt-free. But the Federal Reserve Act changed everything. From that point on, the government largely stopped creating its own money. Instead, when it needed funds, it started borrowing them. But borrowing from whom? From the Federal Reserve. Here's how it works. The Fed creates money, essentially out of thin air, by making accounting entries on a computer. It then lends this newly created money to the U.S. government by purchasing treasury bonds. So, our national currency is now born as a loan, with interest attached. This simple but profound shift transferred the real power over money from our elected officials in Congress to a small, unelected group of central bankers. The people's representatives could no longer control the nation's purse strings. This system turned debt into the engine of the economy. For the government to spend, it must borrow. For the economy to grow, more money meaning more debt must be created. And what's the consequence of constantly creating more money? Inflation. Before the Federal Reserve was established, the United States experienced periods of inflation and deflation, but the long-term value of the dollar was relatively stable. $1 in 1800 was worth roughly the same as $1 in 1913. But after 1913, inflation became a permanent, built-in feature of the American economic landscape. The dollar has lost over 96% of its purchasing power since the Fed was created. Every dollar you earn, every dollar you save, is constantly losing value. This isn't an accident. It's a direct result of a system that continuously expands the money supply. The creation of the Fed also gave this small group of bankers immense power to steer the economy. By adjusting interest rates and the money supply, they could create economic booms or trigger devastating crashes. If you look at the major economic cycles of the 20th century, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, they all align closely with the policy decisions made by the Federal Reserve. They became the masters of the boom-bust cycle, with the power to make or break fortunes on a massive scale. For decades, there was still one check on this power: the gold standard. The US dollar was redeemable for a fixed amount of gold, which meant there was a physical limit to how much money could be created. But in 1971, that final restraint was severed. President Nixon officially took the US off the gold standard, turning the dollar into a purely fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith in the government and the central bank. With the gold standard gone, the floodgates opened. The ability to create money became truly unlimited. And what happened? The national debt, which had been manageable for most of American history, exploded into the stratosphere. Politicians found it irresistible. Why make tough decisions like raising taxes or cutting spending when you can just have the central bank print the money you need to cover the deficit? But this free money comes at a heavy cost, and it's a cost paid by everyday people. As the government borrows and spends trillions of newly created dollars, the value of every existing dollar goes down. Your savings are silently eroded. The cost of living, from groceries to gas to housing, steadily rises. Your wages might go up, but they rarely keep pace with the real costs of inflation. You work harder just to stay in the same place. It's a hidden tax that punishes savers and rewards debtors. That secret meeting on Jekyll Island wasn't just a historical footnote. It was the moment the very nature of money in America was fundamentally changed. It marked the point where control shifted from a system accountable to the public to a system run by private financial interests for their own benefit. The power to create money is the power to control. And on that day, America began to lose control. The consequences of that secret hunting trip are still shaping our lives, our economy, and our future every single day. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive into financial history interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content that uncovers the stories behind the headlines. See you in the next one.